like to welcome everybody here today. My name is Grâce Ndjako, program maker at Studium Generale. I have, together with my colleagues, organized this lecture today and a whole series called Global Philosophies, in which we like to introduce you on campus, but also people watching us at home on YouTube, to different philosophies than you might usually encounter, especially in your education here in Delft. So for today, we have actually I would say maybe one of the less known philosophies in our part of the world, certainly for me as well, and I'm definitely an aficionado of philosophy. We wanted to explore African philosophy. So, as a program maker, my job is to look for people who can bring the story from an academic perspective and who know more about it than I do. So very naively, I contacted our speaker today, Grâce Ndjako, and I said, can you come to Delft and tell us more about African philosophy? She thought about it for a while, and really the response was, before we get deeply into the content of African philosophy, wisdom, and worldviews, perspectives, knowledge, and wisdom, we have to understand the context and the history. And that's what we're going to do today. That's why we've entitled the lecture Colonialism and Philosophy in Africa, because to understand the one, first we have to understand the other as well. And just a quick note, this is a part one of a part two, so Grâce is going to come back probably sometime after Christmas to give the part two. Grâce, thank you for coming. You are a philosopher yourself. You work at the University of Amsterdam. You're a translator, an essayist, a poet. I've perused your website. I don't know if anybody here has been there, but you have a lot of your writings up there as well. We're going to listen to this lecture and, of course, the PowerPoint. And at the end, we'll have time for questions and conversation with Grâce. So please give your attention to Grâce for the next half hour, and a warm welcome, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
So hi, my name is Grâce Ndjako. Like Glass said, I'm specialized in African philosophy, decolonial theory, and black feminism. And I teach non-Western philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm also currently working on my doctoral thesis at the University of Amsterdam. As Glass said, first today we're going to talk a bit more about the historical context for the Eurocentrism Eurocentrism and coloniality that we see in philosophy today. As I think that it is important to point out that this dismissive attitude, the reason why African philosophy is one of the lesser known philosophies, as Glass said, it's because of a long-standing dismissive attitude towards everything that wasn't Western in philosophy, and particularly a dismissive attitude towards African philosophy. But it is important to note that this dismissive attitude towards non-Western traditions is fairly new, as when you look at the broader a broader history, as this attitude stems from the 19th century, which is also the era of European colonial expansion. As before the 19th century, philosophy in Europe did not have its own academic chair. It was not yet institutionalized before the 19th century, meaning that there was no strict division between philosophy and other academic disciplines. Many philosophers of the Western canon, such as René Descartes and David Hume, were not professional philosophers, as John Locke and René Descartes, for example, were mathematicians first and foremost. That was their position within their respective universities. So when philosophy gets its own academic chair in the 19th century, this is in Germany, it first started in Germany, philosophy starts to push back against other disciplines in order to distinguish itself as its own discipline. It is also during this time that Western philosophy starts to become more skeptical and even dismissive towards other philosophical traditions. They now came to be considered not as philosophy, but as teachings of wisdom that need to be studied by a philologist, meaning someone who studies languages, and not by a philosopher. And of course, if we look at the broader global historical context, the 19th century will also be more marked by colonial, imperial expansion. So then Western philosophers from the 19th century on become dismissive of philosophical traditions from other regions of the world, and don't consider these traditions to be philosophical, a notion that goes on till this day. And so decolonization then means a renewed acknowledgement of the existence of other non-Western philosophical traditions. And it is also about acknowledging that Europe is not at the center of human reason. It's about provincializing Europe, as you will. Zimbabwean philosopher Mungwini states in this regard that philosophy needs to be equipped to face the new historical realities of a world in which there is no longer a place for that one hegemonic culture. This also means that decolonization is not simply decolonizing an academic curriculum, or decolonizing the university cannot simply be about bringing more diversity into a certain setting. So, for example, just introducing Islamic or African philosophy into a set canon. So as more attention is being paid to other parts of the world, as this lecture series also does, so more attention is being paid to other parts in the world from the same Europe that had once colonized these regions. Then it is important to proceed with caution and reflect on this newfound interest as well. Before one can really earnestly engage with other philosophical traditions, one has to be committed to the project that is decolonization, to fully understand why other philosophical traditions had been given its subpar position, to understand why it has been discarded. One has to understand the historical context in which this happened, the history of colonialism. And so we have to understand what is colonialism and what coloniality then consists of. As Jamaican philosopher Lewis Gordon asserts, the project of decolonizing philosophy depends on what it means for philosophy to be colonized. And in this context, a couple of key concepts are Eurocentrism and coloniality. So one of the aspects that derives from colonialism, which led to the devaluation of African philosophy and African culture, is Eurocentrism. As the name already indicates, Eurocentrism is a type of egocentrism in the way it centers the self, which is in this case Europe. And then the person who is egotistic has a diminished capacity to place oneself, to place him or herself in another person's point of view or feelings, which leads to the self-centered person centering their own views and interests and assuming that these are shared by others, which explains and clarifies the definition of Eurocentrism as the tendency to view one's own group and its social standards as the basis for evaluative judgment concerning the practices of others, with the implication that one views one's standards as superior. And then the other concept is that of coloniality. It's important to establish a difference between colonialism and coloniality. As philosopher Maldonado Torres states, whereas colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such a nation an empire, coloniality instead refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration. He then states that coloniality survives colonialism, It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. And of course, us here who live in the Netherlands, today is 6th December, yesterday it was the 5th of December, like even the whole tradition of Zwarte Piet is an example of coloniality. So maybe Holland, the Netherlands, they don't have colonies in the formal sense anymore, as Indonesia and Suriname have been given their independence. The Caribbean islands of Aruba, of course, and Curaçao still are somewhat in a colonial position. But formally, most of the Dutch colonies have been given their independence, but that doesn't mean that structures of dominance and the ideology which made this colonialism possible have perished. Like we see in traditions such as Zwarte Piet, that it still exists, and that is coloniality. So Zwarte Piet is an example of this coloniality, which also the common usage in Dutch of the N-word is also an example of this coloniality. So then the colonial endeavor pertained itself beyond the realms of political domination and economic exploitation. So like the Dutch aren't necessarily economically exploiting Indonesia or Suriname anymore, but by these various forms of coloniality, they are still asserting their dominance over these other peoples. So then, coloniality is then a form of this cultural domination still being alive. So then, colonialism so imposed itself not only by the political and economic exploitation, also cultural domination, and also through the imposed languages and religion. So that even as the colonizers officially leave a former colony, the effects of it remain through the cultural rupture that coloniality brought upon. This means that decolonization needs to take this into account. And then in the Dutch context, we also know this as, for example, the reason why the Dutch language is still so important in Suriname. It's because the Dutch language having been imposed on Suriname for so long, and this also goes for other Caribbean countries that have been colonized by European nations, where either French, English, or Spanish are still the official languages, and this goes for Africa as well, as most African countries, especially the sub-Saharan African countries, still have European languages as their official languages. So this then also is coloniality still being in effect. So then this is a quote by Aimé Césaire, who was a poet and thinker and intellectual from Martinique. As he states, they talk to me about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, improved standards of living. I'm talking about societies drained of their essence, cultures trampled underfoot, institutions undermined, lands confiscated, religion smashed, magnificent artistic creations destroyed, extraordinary possibilities wiped out. This is a quote from Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire, in which he talked about the consequences that colonialism has, while Europe sought to justify colonialism by saying that it brings about progress in the global south, in former colonized countries. He talks about colonialism as the effect it has on the culture. So he's talking in effect about coloniality here, as he talks about the cultures that were trampled underfoot. And in his country of Martinique, which is still a French colony, it's still very much, this coloniality is still very much felt as, well, you can compare the status of Martinique a bit to the status a lot of these Dutch islands in the Caribbean have to the Netherlands. So then, the responses of many academic philosophers to non-Western traditions are examples of a Eurocentric view, as they assumed philosophy to be European and necessarily so. So then, as the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe criticizes this type of Eurocentric view as he discusses the work of Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, to him it is a matter of recentering, which in this context means rejecting the assumption that the modern West is the central root of Africa's consciousness and cultural heritage. It is about rejecting the notion that Africa is merely an extension of the West. It pertains to a larger issue, namely that the university as a colonial, westernized institution, and in his article and in his paper, Mbembe shows how this Eurocentrism also plays at the academic level. He talks about academic institutions as being westernized. As he says, they are westernized in the sense that they are local instantiations of a dominant academic model based on a Eurocentric epistemic canon. A Eurocentric canon is a canon that attributes truth only to the Western way of knowledge production. Lewis Gordon argues that there is the historical rise of a cultural group as a self-avowed sole progenitor of philosophical practice. This hegemonic declaration accompanied historical forces such as the spread of Euro-modern colonialism from the 15th century onward. In its rise followed a biconditional presupposition of Europe as a cause and also an effect of philosophy. That is, philosophy must be European, or in another formulation, Western. He continues by saying, the use of a term from European languages is often confused with the concept and its origin. Gordon points out the fallacy of this type of argument. The conjunction of the Greek words philo, meaning loving, and sophia, wisdom. The claim is that philosophy's origins are in ancient Greece, and thus its legacy becomes not only Greek, but European, despite most Europeans not being or ever having been Greek, or even the fact that to the ancient Greeks they were not necessarily mainly influenced or had the most cultural exchange with, for example, the Dutch or the Scandinavians, but they probably had more cultural ties to other cultures in the regions, Mediterranean cultures, Middle Eastern countries, cultures. Yet it is here, Yet it is the philosophy faculties in Holland or Sweden that can claim to have Greek heritage, whereas a Macedonian or a Persian or a Turkish person who probably comes from has an ancestry of people's cultures that probably had more to do with ancient Greeks than the Dutch, Swedish, or Danish people had. So, also to point out that this is kind of ridiculous. But anyway, so in this context, it is important to note that ancient Greeks is a construction that gained currency during French and German Enlightenment. Yeah, so it's a construct to refer to ancient Greek-speaking peoples of the Mediterranean. But as Lewis Gordon argues, those people included, those Greek-speaking people of the Mediterranean also included Northern Africans, Western Asians, and Southern peoples of what later became known as Europe, so the Mediterranean European countries. So then this myth of ancient Greeks is a product of Euro-modern imagination, with a series of empires laying claim to the coveted metonymic intellectual identity for posterity. Ancient Greek stands as a supposed miracle from which a hitherto dark and presumably intellectually limited humanity fell sway to what eventually became through Latin civilization. And then the problem with Western philosophy and philosophers, according to Gordon, is that there has been and unfortunately continues to be, however, the use of philosophical reflections also for a rationalization and evasions of human responsibility, not only to each other, but also to other aspects of reality. Euromodern colonialism stimulated lines of ethno-philosophical movements, often disguised to themselves as universal and primary. So then, we are now going to take a look at some of the most notorious examples of this Eurocentrism in Western philosophy. So then, this Eurocentrism was exemplified by many of the so-called great European philosophers. As Immanuel Kant, the famous German philosopher, once wrote, "The Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that rises above the trifling." Mr. Hume challenges anyone to cite a single example in which a Negro has shown talents, and asserts that among the hundreds of thousands of blacks who were transported elsewhere from their countries, although many of them have even been set free, still not a single one was ever found who presented anything great in art or science or any other praiseworthy quality, even though among the whites some continually rise aloft from the lowest rabble and through superior gifts earn respect in the world. So fundamental is the difference between these two races of men, and it appears to be as great in regard to mental capacities as in color. So this is Kant, who is seen as the greatest European philosopher since Aristotle. But this is the way. This is how he thought of black people, and he also didn't have all too favorable opinions about women either. So then we can see that according to philosophers such as Kant and Hume, Africans don't have mental capacities and are thus not capable of philosophical thought. And then Hegel, he calls Africa the land of childhood which, lying beyond the day of self-conscious history, is enveloped in the dark mantle of night. As he states, in Negro life, the characteristic point is the fact that consciousness has not yet attained to the realization of any substantial objective existence. The African is natural man in his completely wild and untamed state. This means that Africa is ahistorical, outside of history, and doesn't have morality, religion, or political institutions. So then this Eurocentrism consists of a refusal to attribute a developed consciousness to the other, in this case Africans. It sees itself as the norm. Africa is a child, and since it is a child, it cannot exist or survive without the supervision of an adult, which in this case is Europe. And it is up to the adult to teach and raise a child. Its progress will be judged by the adult, and his or her likeness to him or her will serve as a measure. Chile typifies this as a violent way of dismissing the indigenous people's knowledge as irrelevant, and a way of disconnecting them from what they knew and how they knew it. But of course, in this case, these European philosophers and their own thinking is not pure reason as much as they would like to believe. It is also historically and culturally dependent, as even a philosopher such as Herder pointed out, who was a philosopher who also lived in the same time as Kant and Hegel, pointed out that many of the values and notions that Kant saw as universal were actually very much particular to the German language. So, therefore, could not be universal. And it is important to note that in expressing these views, Kant and Hegel were not the exception in European philosophy. Similar views were also expressed by other philosophers, such as David Hume, whom Kant quoted in the text that we just saw, so that Kant directly references, but also British philosopher John Locke, who had even invested in African slavery, and had he had an investment in the transatlantic slave trade. He made money off of slavery, and he had also justified Native American expropriation, and also helped working on various laws that would allow the expropriation of lands by land owned by Native Americans. And it would be tempting to dismiss the racist views of Locke, Hume, Kant, and Hegel as not being central to their philosophical works, as many maybe when you study philosophy, you for example, when you study Hegel, you more likely study Phänomenologie des Geistes, or phenomenology of spirit, and not necessarily be confronted with what he wrote here, which stems from the philosophy of history, and Kant's racist views are not necessarily directly expressed in Kritik der reinen Vernunft. So then, when only studying these works in an academic setting, you might go through your studies, your bachelor's, not being made aware of the fact that this is also a side to Kant. There is also this side of Kant and Hegel. For example, I was not prepared to learn this about Kant. I studied philosophy in Amsterdam and also in Paris. When I was in Paris, I took a course on aesthetics, and so I started reading various works by various philosophers. And also I also read a book by Kant, which was about the beauty and the sublime, and there it was. Then the quote that I pulled from Kant was from this book on the beauty and the sublime. But since this was a book that I started to read on my own time, but in class we would just only talk about Kritik der reinen Vernunft or other major works, and not necessarily on Kant, on this text, or even Kant's anthropology, in which he also expresses his racist views. But although not in his major works, these were his views. So then also influences the way, informs us on when he talks about human nature. Who did he consider to be human? Because also in the beauty and the sublime, he's not only talking about Africans, but about various other peoples, Arabs, Chinese people, and also women, and being very misogynistic towards them. Yes. So it cannot be dismissed as these racist views cannot be dismissed as not being central to their philosophical work, or as the views of, oh no, just a bunch of dead white philosophers with no bearing, since both Locke and Kant would go on to define mainstream European philosophical, political philosophy, and also they would also come to define mainstream liberal tradition. So as Jamaican philosopher Charles Mills argues that liberal political theory is so shaped by the history of white domination, both national and global, that analogously it tacitly takes as its representative political figure the white male subject. And he continues by saying, liberalism has historically been predominantly a racial liberalism, in which conceptions of personhood and resulting schedules of rights, duties, and government responsibilities have all been racialized. And the contract respondingly has really been a racial one, an agreement among white contractors to subordinate and exploit non-white non-contractors for white benefit. And then he goes on to state that racism is not an anomaly in an unqualified liberal universalism, but generally symbiotically related to a qualified and particularistic liberalism, as both Locke and Kant limited their views on property rights, self-ownership, and personhood racially. So this is what I mean when saying that we cannot dismiss this as these ideas not being central to their work. So that if you just read their major works and and Locke's ideas on human liberty, it is important to have in the to remember to think in the back to think about who did he consider to be a human. So then when he talks about property rights, who were these humans allowed to have property? Because since in Locke's views, Native Americans did not count did not fully count as people. Black people did not fully count as people, so they are also then not the ones entitled to who he imagines having these rights to property or self-ownership or personhood. So then, but yet the liberal tradition is very much based and heavily influenced by the views of these philosophers, Kant and Locke, who had narrow visions of humanity and personhood. So then, Mills argues that contemporary liberalism and liberal political theory, that philosophy, while positing itself as universal, is still comprised by race. We would need to acknowledge that race had underpinned the liberal framework from the outset, refracting the sense of crucial terms, embedding a particular model of rights bearers, dictating a certain historical narrative, and providing an overall theoretical orientation for normative discussions. So we now might cringe at words of Hume, Kant, and Hegel, and take an interest into what the other has to say. But simply deciding to now include these others and their philosophies in the philosophical canon won't suffice, especially if you are not sure whether or not the sentiment that underlies this Eurocentrism, this coloniality, has been surpassed. We might otherwise very well risk falling into the same pitfalls if we don't understand the coloniality in our treatment and rejection of African philosophy. So we have thus passed the stage where all we have to do is finally listen to what these others have to say, as what the others now have to say is also deeply connected and even a response to the colonial past. So then when we talk about colonization of Africa, we think of the image of the scramble for Africa, by which we mean the grabbing for its lands and the grabbing of its natural resources, which also still goes on to this very day. For example, in the Eastern Congo. We think of extraction, that still goes on. While this is a key component of colonialism in Africa, the grabbing extends not just to its material resources, it's also about encapsulating people, capturing people. It is the way one relates to the other, where there is no room for reciprocity. As a French philosopher Sartre states in Black Orpheus, where he talks about this colonial history. For the white man has for 3,000 years enjoyed the privilege of seeing without being seen. They were pure gays. And Aimé Césaire also states, c'est l'Occident qui fait l'ethnographie des autres, non les autres qui font l'ethnographie de l'Occident. So it's always the West which does ethnography on the others, and it's never the others who get to do an ethnography of the West. And in Black Skin, White Mask, Frantz Fanon, also from Martinique, and who used to be a student of Aimé Césaire, describes what the impact of this white gaze is to the colonized black person. As he writes, I arrive slowly in the world, and sudden emergence are no longer my habit. I crawl along. The white gaze, the only valid one, is already dissecting me. I am fixed. Once their microtomes are sharpened, the whites objectively cut sections of my reality. I've been betrayed. I sense, I see in this white gaze that it's the arrival not of a new man, but of a new type of man, a new species, a Negro, in fact. And so this gaze, which Fanon and Césaire and Sartre talked about, translates to the sciences as well. As Lisa points out, the ideology of scientific colonization carried with it the belief that the researchers had unlimited rights of access to any data and information belonging to the population and the right to export data from the colonies for purposes of processing into books and articles. And in his essay of Decolonizing the University, Bembe argues that Western epistemic traditions are traditions that claim detachment of the known from the knower. They rest on a division between mind and world, or between reason and nature as an ontological a priori. They are a tradition in which the knowing subject is enclosed in itself and peeks out at the world of objects and produces supposedly objective knowledge of those objects. The knowing subject is thus able to know the world without being part of the world, which is also something Sartre talks about when he talks about the white man as always seeing but not being seen. And he or she is by all accounts able to produce knowledge that is supposed to be universal and independent of context. So then the Eurocentric academic model produces an anthropological knowledge, which Bebe conceptualizes as a process of knowing about others, but a process that never fully acknowledges these others as thinking and knowledge-producing subjects. And this knowledge that one gains of others is a one-way street, as Césaire also pointed out when he says « C'est l'Occident qui fait l'ethnographie des autres, mais jamais les autres qui font l'ethnographie de l'Occident ». So what should be clear is that even during colonialism, the other was not exactly ignored. The other was seen, as the other was created, objectified, and dissected. The other becomes and symbolizes what the person who sees needs it to be in order to create its own image. The other, the presence of the other, is always seen as serving the ends of the white. The other always exists for and in service of the white. As Mills points out, whiteness is defined in part in respect to an oppositional darkness, so that white self-conceptions of identity, personhood, and self-respect are then intimately tied up with the repudiation of the black other. So then this coloniality and this Eurocentrism and this white gaze that always fixes and dissects the other, by decolonial scholars and anti-colonial thinkers and writers have pushed back against this, and it is this aspect of Westernization and Eurocentric academic model that also intellectual movements such as the Negritude would come to criticize. But then this is the historical context from which they've done so, and in a second part I will go on further more into these responses that came from African philosophers, African writers, decolonial and anti-colonial writers and thinkers. But I thought it was important to first point out this historical context, as also black feminist scholar Bell Hooks wrote in her essay Eating the Other. The contemporary crisis of identity in the West, especially as experienced by white youth, are eased when the primitive is recouped via focus on diversity and pluralism, which suggests the other can provide life-sustaining alternatives. And she also says, within commodity culture, ethnicity becomes spice, seasoning that can liven up the doll's dish. that is mainstream white culture. And this then especially becomes a problem if there is no emphasis on the colonial context from which these African philosophies, black feminist theories, or anti-colonial theories arise. So then in this case, it's a setting of the reason why African philosophy has been systematically ignored. So then in approaching the other anti-colonial thinkers, African philosophers, black feminists, whether it's by engaging with different philosophical traditions or with different cultures or the peoples themselves, one should prevent it from becoming just another type of spice to be added. So yeah, this is lecture.
Thank you, guys. We're going to take a few minutes for a Q&A. I wanted to ask you a first question because it was pretty confrontational, the quotes, especially from Kant and Hegel that you showed.
Yeah.
They're talking about being objective, and that's a quality that you need to be a philosopher. And they said, I think it was the Hegel quote that he literally says, Africans aren't objective, therefore not capable. Do you think that...
Because for him, it means because he thought that to be able to do philosophy, one needs to have a certain amount of... one needs to... then the concept of freedom is important to have... to be able to do philosophy, and he thought that Africans did not have a notion of freedom.
Do you think you'd actually ever met an African?
No, I don't think so. Especially
with
Kant, we know for sure because he never left his town.
Right. And he never crossed his own mind to wonder about his own objectivity.
No.
So what about here in Delft? Because I know in Delft, a lot of people here probably in the room have had Kantian ethics, the ethics taught by Kant. Do you think that the TU Delft also, when it's teaching this form of ethics, that it should mention, for example, this context of these thinkers?
So, and yes, I do think it is important so that to know that as they are having these grand theories of human freedom or of the human nature, that they're thinking about a very small group of people. That they're not considering everyone, and it's not just African people. It's also Asians, Middle Eastern peoples, and also women. Women of any race that they didn't consider as part of this humanity capable of reason.
So I want to give people in the room a chance to ask questions. I have one more. I swear. Can you say briefly what the impact of this kind of thinking has been on, say, 20th century African philosophers? Coming from this background, this context of colonialism and Eurocentrism and racism, and then, building institutions, universities that we're used to in the West as institutions, but then imposed with this kind of thinking as well. How do you even deal with that?
How do you mean? Like,
as an African philosopher, that you're coming out of this tradition with your own background as well to deal with. So how do you rhyme those two? How did they rhyme those things together?
Well, that's what I'm going to talk about in part 2 as well, because the Negritude had their own particular response to this Eurocentrism, to this coloniality, which they fought against, and also from there's also a response that came from black feminist theory against this coloniality.
All right, so I jumped the gun. That's for next time. Okay. For today, does anybody have any questions about Grâce's lecture? You had your finger raised.
Any question?
Because I think what you said was these quotes, Kant and Hegel, they prided themselves on being systematic thinkers, but then how did they arrive at this kind of perspective?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, for Hegel, it was part of his system, because in the philosophy of history, he tries to make a history of the human of the spirit of the Geist, and in order to do so, he divides the world up into various stages, various worlds. So then is the world of antiquity, the world it's Latin and Greek antiquity, a German world, and an Indian and Chinese world, and an African world, and he tries to he makes the argument for in how far how the Geist has developed. So for him, part of his whole philosophy is the development of this Geist towards a point of absolute knowledge. And for him, each of these worlds represent different stages into this development. But then for him, there is no Geist in Africa, so it falls outside of the outside of this. So then it's very much so it is part of the system to be this racist for him. So then and the Geist has become most developed then in this German world, which has come to the most to its fruition, and he attributes for example for the Chinese and the Indians and Indians not as in Native Americans but in Indians from India, so that they do have some sort of abstract thinking. But it's to him not yet philosophy because it's still it doesn't have this notion of freedom in their abstract thinking doesn't have the notion of freedom because it's still so contingent on mythology and religion. But then it's a lower stage in this development of the Geist.
I see, but why not, for example, the other way around? The Africans were seen to have some form of abstract thinking and the Indians not. I mean, what was he reading? Was he reading all sorts of?
Most of they're just mostly just going off of writings by colonial colonial ethnography. So that's what they based their theories on. They had never been to Africa or to the New World, the Americas, where enslaved Africans were brought. So they were they're going off they were going off of writings and not by their own observation. They didn't do any field work. So, but that's not to say that if they had done field work, if they had met Africans, that they would come to different views. For example, because they might never have met Africans or people from or descendants from Africans, but they did meet women and still had very misogynistic views about women. They still thought that women were not capable of reason as well, and they had met. So it's not just a matter of that they have enough data to go on. It's also just their own flaws. It's not as if had they just been given the right data, they would have come to different conclusions. No, because otherwise, how would you explain their views about women?
Can I bring that back to my question before then? Like, say that we make people at the TU Delft aware of the biases of certain philosophers. How will that impact students if they know about that context?
For me, it's then knowing that their theories are also just theories, that it's not maybe this universal truth that it has for a long time been taught as, that there are limits. So, and decolonial scholars highlight their limits, such as Charles Mills,
To step out of this assumption of universality.
Yeah. For example, when I was writing my master's thesis, I was still taught by professors that Kant and Hegel were so universal, and that they are also universal to Africans. But like, how can they be universal to Africans if they had these views about Africans?
Right. A question over here. So how do you feel about, or how optimistic are you about philosophy as it's being taught and researched in Africa by universities and professors who have already started work on this, I forget the word you used. Emancipation, sorry.
I would not even say emancipation, because emancipation is also still just implies that there is a certain framework already set that you just have to that you have to make some kind of progression inside of a set framework. Because for me, decolonization is also about questioning the very existence of this framework in place. So that's why I don't really like the term emancipation in this regard.
Maybe I'm not making you represent.
All right. So to what extent have universities and philosophers in Africa taken their space, you know, to claim their own
It's
philosophies?
it's not the same for every African country. As I've seen some African academic institutions taken more of this a step towards decolonizing philosophy than other academic institutions which are still very much influenced by the European canon. But there has been a lot of a change and a movement towards decoloniality, decolonialism in many African, especially I've seen this happening especially in Nigerian academic institutions. Not so much yet in the Congo, where my own roots are, where my own roots lie. But yes, it varies. I've also a lot of South Africans and black South Africans and black Zimbabweans have been moving towards this decoloniality more and more, but it varies from country to country.
We have time for one last question. Anybody on this side? The question is, I think, are there Western philosophers who are now revisiting these European philosophers from this perspective and with this knowledge of their Eurocentrism and racism?
Yes, there are. I don't recall where I've read it, but also even in the Netherlands, you know, like professors who are specialized in the working in the works of Kant are more and more becoming conscious of this racist side to his views, and like looking to recontextualize his writings. That is happening more and more. Not just abroad, but also in the Netherlands. I think there was an article in the Groene Amsterdammer or the NRC, which was an article written by two professors who specialized in Kantian philosophy, trying to recontextualize, reread him under this new light. Yeah.
So it's a process of what you said before about seeing but not being seen,
yeah.
And now it's turning the gaze back on themselves.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all our time we have for today. Can you show us the next slide, please, Grâce?
Which?
The next slide, or the last slide, if you can skip all the way to the end.
The last slide?
There you go. Yep, that's the one. So just to announce, for next week, we have another lecture in the Global Philosophy series. Can you see this, guys? It's by Marcus Balkenhol on Vinti philosophy, which is originally an African religion that was brought by enslaved people to Suriname and is still practiced in Suriname, but also in the Netherlands, and also plays a role in identity and emancipation. So it's going to be a really interesting lecture next week. We have one on Sufism coming up right before Christmas, and of course, next year we'll continue with the series. Grâce will come back again for part 2. You guys are all warmly invited for that as well. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Grâce, and another round of applause.